Welcome to the Heretic's Guide to Gemstone, the greatest historical exploration series on the internet for the massively multiplayer text-based game, GemStone III. I'm your host, the player of Xorus. Now, the game's present incarnation, of course, is GemStone IV, but I'm calling it GemStone III. And the reason I'm calling it that is because most of what we will be looking at in this series is from the GemStone III period of the game's history. GemStone III was 1989 through 2003. The 1989 through 1995 half of it was the Ice Age, when the world was called Thea rather than Alanthea. The Ice Age was not GemStone II. GemStone II was actually Alanthea as well. Confusing, I know. What we'll be concerned with here is mostly from the Ice Age period. We will be exploring one of the mysterious realms of the game. The most mysterious of the mysterious realms, a very old area known as the Broken Lands. What is the Broken Lands? Well, the rumor has long been that it is the moon, that it is the surface of the moon of the dark gods, now called Lornon. It was treated that way in the 2008 release of 350, the cleric's self-resurrection spell, Miracle. But that was GemStone IV. It was a retcon. It doesn't count. It's not at all obvious that the original intent for the Broken Lands in the Ice Age was for it to literally be somewhere on the moon of the Dark Gods. Not least of which because the backstory document for the Broken Lands explicitly called it another plane of existence. There are serious inconsistencies between the Broken Lands and the Ice source books for the moon of the Dark Gods. It is unquestionably associated with the Dark Gods, but you have to remember in the Ice Age lore, the Dark Gods were not native to this plane of existence. So one thing we will have to do in this video series is set the Broken Lands into its original context in the archaic world setting. This is much the same thing and closely related to what I did in the second and third episodes of my Graveyard series. In fact, I believe the Broken Lands is in some ways a kind of sequel or spin-off of the Graveyard story, though it is not obvious. You will see later why I think they are closely related. Now, if you have watched my series on the Graveyard, you know I explored its Ice Age context, trying to figure out how much of that world setting mattered, and that I illustrated how the Graveyard was significantly off-canon for that world setting, that it had its own concept and was doing its own thing. You would also recall that I think the Graveyard itself is symbolically related to the game's original death mechanics, and that its design was encoding an allegory based on real-world literature and comparative mythology. Specifically, it was underworld mythology, along with Dante's Inferno and a few horror stories by H.P. Lovecraft. I will tell you up front that I hold the same fundamental theory for the Broken Lands, that it is in a very subtle way underworld themed, symbolically parallel to the death mechanics, and based on those very same horror stories by H.P. Lovecraft. This means we can leverage off the Graveyard series videos since it involves a lot of the same stuff. I covered the death mechanics in episode 4, and I explored the allegory in episode 5. So for the Broken Lands series, we will really only need 3 episodes because I've already covered a lot of it. In this first episode, we will do an overview of the Broken Lands and its history. In the second episode, we will explore its ice context. And then in the third episode, we will do allegory. Why I think the Broken Lands is really about the old death mechanics and what I think the higher concept of the place was really implying. I might be wrong about all of that, but we'll give it our best shot. Make the strongest theory we can for it. So let's back up, talk about the Broken Lands itself and its history. The Broken Lands was all made in the Ice Age except for the Sheruvian Monastery, which was released in late 1997. The original parts of the Broken Lands were made by former GM Kygar. The Sheruvian Monastery was mostly made by former GM Cazor. They are no longer with us. They both have memorials of sorts in the game. Bonespear Tower is essentially a memorial for Kygar, for example. But Caesar might have intended the Broken Lands to be Lornon. I'm not sure. My vague understanding is that there were going to be more areas, more stuff related to the Lornon gods, some stuff that was built and is still floating around, disconnected on the GM back end. But when the Broken Lands was originally created, there was no Lornon. The Dark Gods were the Dark Lords of Couronne. We are really fortunate in that, to a certain extent, we actually have a statement of authorial intent from Kygar about what the Broken Lands was about and how it was designed. There was an interview he did in the Calthea Chronicles in September or October 1994, the Ice Age newsletter that was after the ASCII format Cal 4 edition ended. These were in a proprietary portable document format .dp files, which you had to open with the Windows or Macintosh program called Common Ground Viewer. The .dp stood for digital paper. Common Ground was an early competitor to Adobe Acrobat. Obviously, they lost. I was able to get these open using a Windows XP emulator and glued together screen captures to make them into PDFs. Why did I have these obscure, almost forgotten newsletters? Well, I have the best kung fu. So, in the interview, Kygar said he usually designs an area with a concept, that there's reason and purpose behind most of the stuff he creates, and that he plans the whole thing out, the history and all of that, before actually creating any of it. And that the additional part of the Broken Lands is an extension of the same original concept. This is important because the Broken Lands areas were released over a few years. Unity of vision, so to speak, cannot be taken for granted. So we know he created the history and all that before building any of it, and we are justified in interpreting it as a unified whole, except for the Sheruvian Monastery, which was made by someone else. In fact, the Sealfar Strake itself, now called the Lysierian Hills, was part of this design concept. He wanted a hidden portal to an exotic locale in the foothills of a mountain, with a sylvan surrounding as contrast for it. That was the base concept, before anything else, all the weird stuff, before the Dark God stuff. The Sealfar Strake was part of the region map of Kelborn that had not been used yet. Kelborn is the land around Claysburn Bay, what we now call Darkstone Bay. Sealfar Strake was the northern peninsula. The peninsula is still there on post-ice maps, but the Lysierian Hills was squished further south on the 1998 region map. So that was the location chosen for the hidden portal. Then he needed a theme for it. He did a lot of sourcebook reading and then settled on an unlife invasion theme. The main thread the story and areas would be grown upon. The premise became the working relationship between the Dark Gods and the Unlife during the Wars of Dominion. There is no way to translate this into the modern world setting of Valanthia. It is very deep into the arcane nuances of the Shadow World setting. So, while it was unclear to what depth the Shadow World context really matters to the Graveyard, those issues are at the very core of the Broken Lands. What's worse, if you have seen the third episode of my Graveyard series, I went over some of this. This issue of the forces behind the Wars of Dominion evolved over real-world time. In the earlier Ice books up through 1989, the Wars of Dominion were caused by the forces of the Unlife, while from 1990 onward, it was driven mostly by the Dark Gods. Kygar was noticing some 1990 overlap in the source material. The Unlife being driven back into Couronne, the Dark Lords of Couronne being defeated at the end of the Wars of Dominion. This is essentially a retcon of elaboration in the Shadow World setting, and we have to guess how Kygar interpreted it himself. In the interview, Kygar also explicitly said that what he was doing was non-canon for Rolemaster, that there was a concept to be figured out and the world logic of it all makes sense. I can only encourage people to look beyond the surface, his exact words. So we know there was a higher concept, and speculating about it is justified. The trouble is we do not know his own interpretation of all that. The Sealfar Strake was released in the first half of 1992, This is the Lysierian Hills without the Krovan village or Lake Marlies. Kygar made the Fire Cats, the Smoky Caves, though the extension to it with the War Cats was added after the Ice Age. The Kraul, the Krovan, were introduced later because they needed creatures with certain combat characteristics in that level range. That is, they were not part of the design concept for the CFR Strait. They were added on ad hoc later. And that was part of a storyline in late 1993, maybe into 1994 during the newsletter gap, with Marlies, the shape-shifting puma, a damsel in distress, kidnapped, which led to the release of Alora's shrine, now called Amera. I might talk a little more about that in the later videos. Alora had hundreds of shrines like it in Shadow World canon. All those Order of Olm task shrines were released in 1994. That one was the first. But the Monastery with the Monastic Liches and Spectral Monks was released in mid-1992. It was reported in the July 1992 Cal 4 edition. The rune-covered ring was there at first, but it was dormant and mysterious. Monastic Liches have always summoned Keelan. Then, in the April 1993 Cal 4 edition, hooded figures had showed up attacking town, and this portal was discovered leading to the Broken Lands. At this point, the Uthex Cathiasis story was released. You need to know Uthex's name to solve the stairway puzzle. There was the power-draining dome with the giant fog beetles on the jagged plain. Then the Magru tunnels, Miclean Cavern, and Dark Shrine with the Vrul and Dark Vortices was not released until roughly early 1994. Those were not the original names of those monsters. I will address that in the second episode. I'm not going to look closely at the creatures in this episode, but that expansion had its own documentation, the Temple of Darkness poem, which has some off-canon descriptions of the Dark Gods. Kygar also took the Irraric glossary from the source books and added a bunch of non-canonical notes to them. That is, there are lore details for the Irraric language that are only true in GemStone, specific to the Broken Lands. That's something I'll get into in great gory detail in the second episode. So, what is the basic story of Uthex Cathiasis and the Broken Lands? The story was called The Broken Land, singular, not plural. There's a rumor that it was named after the Broken Land Parkway in Maryland, near the old Simulatronics headquarters. I have no idea if that is true or myth-making, but the story title was in the singular. The actual name of the place was in the dead language of Irraric, the Mata Punterken, the home of broken lore. The Uthex story is fairly simple. Uthex was a lore master. The lore masters were leading the struggle against the forces of darkness in the Wars of the Dominion. Uthex discovered a new source of power and wanted to give it physical form to aid in the wars. This involved something he found through a portal to another plane of existence. His work was twisted into perilous forms under the subtle influence of the servants of the Unlife. Then Uthex became corrupted to evil, and his fellows came and smited him. But they were not able to destroy all of his experiments. So they put runes of warding on the portal, and the monastery was founded to watch over it, hidden and fortified underground. Then the monks were eventually corrupted and turned themselves into monastic liches. Tragic story, they became the very evil they were struggling against. So let's do a sort of basic walkthrough of what the Broken Lands related areas have in them. Broadly, you have to include the outside, the idyllic scenery as contrast. There's the Fire Cat Caves, which are interesting because their niches might be read as insinuating resting places for humanoids. This stands out because later with the Marlies storyline, there was a puma that would shapeshift into a woman. That's a very Central American folklore thing. Nahuals, shamans shapeshifting into pumas and jaguars. It's a major aspect of the Mesoamerican calendar systems. Mayan calendar, the Aztec calendar, that kind of thing. Maybe that's why the climax of that story involved a lunar alignment. But Near that is a room with a ring of mushrooms. Those are called fairy rings. There's Fae mythology around those, kidnapping to the other world. Not obviously relevant, worth noting at least. The creatures in the Sealfar Strake, Monastery and Broken Lands, by the way, were made with a natural growth design philosophy. They were designed to naturally fit the places they are found, whether or not they were tractable to fight. Some of the creatures are almost unfightable by some professions. So later we will be dissecting the creatures for meaning. The Sealfar Strake is mostly just woodland critters. One of these rooms calls the area the Land of the Silver Mist. That's the term for Kelborn in the Shadow World source book for the region. When you approach the waterfall with the hidden monastery, you pass by a finger-shaped boulder. That will be important later in the third episode. Then inside you have the familiar puzzle for lifting the stone door. It involves sending a small familiar down into the monastery sewer and using stones as weights to raise the door mechanism. The sewer originally had rat snakes in it. I would speculate those were removed for pointlessly wasting resources. Back then they had to be careful with how many things were actively spawned in the game. Too much stuff at once and the game would crash. It would actually do invasions to try to make people log off because of the danger of item droppage upon death. But inside the monastery you have a meditation room with an elaborate geometric pattern for focusing on. It has a lapis lazuli triangle at the center. There are chakras that resemble it. It's kind of an Eastern monk thing, like the Keelin are Chinese or Buddhist, but other aspects are like a Western monastery. In the third episode, I will look at the possibility of taking that more literally. There are various items, statues, painting, shadow box, rare black modware, which would have said Windak originally. That's idiosyncratic, not canon. The painting says it is depicting the Undead War, but that would have said Wars of Dominion originally. There were no Undead Wars in the Shadow World history. The carvings of wild horses are interesting because Silver Valley would have been somewhere up in the Sealfar Strake, but the monastery is a few years older than the Shadow Valley story. So circle that and put a question mark over it. These items are frustrating because they seem like they ought to mean something, but I do not see any deeper sense in them. Anything I come up with is weak. There are real-world cave monasteries, even fortified ones underground, like Varzia in the country of Georgia. But it's not obvious to me if this is directly based on something historical or fictional. It seems like the monastery is just designed to flavor the idea that these monks were cloistered together for a very long time by themselves. That they were, isolated from the outside world, lonely, only having these representative objects for the outside. They had their Spartan monastic cells, the communal living areas, the library, a privy and sewer system. Cells, by the way, is a historically informed term, the living quarters in monasteries. Though I will say that if you have this theme of monastic asceticism, being rid of worldly possessions, the pursuit of the spiritual, and yet the monastery is ornately decorated and has all these worldly possessions in it. So maybe there's some indication in that of the monks falling from their path. There's then the hidden passageway down to where the abbot resides. The emotive faces above the doorways also seem like they should mean something. It was 1992, but these are like emojis. But if it's a reference rather than just some descent into madness flavoring, it's going over my head. It is implying they were driven mad by the unlife before turning themselves into the undead. The happy face is toward the surface, the sad face is the ruined library. The face in great pain is in the direction of the Broken Lands, the abbot's bedroom. The misty chamber and its portal is through a hidden opening in the abbot's bedroom. The backstory has the monastery being founded to keep guard over the portal, and then it was lost to history and forgotten. So the monks were struggling against the forces of the unlife inside this mountain for centuries. Eventually they were corrupted and fell to the very dark power they had been fighting. If I had to guess, this probably happened from studying texts removed from the Broken Lands, and then getting corrupted that way, much in the same way Uthex himself was corrupted by servants of the unlife. Though it's possible it was from interacting with the hooded figures. Maybe they were very lonely and were seduced by the enemy. Then through the portal is Uthex's abode, where he had a living space, and then there's a secret entrance to the Jagged Plain. This is behind a panel which depicts the moons, and having to push the one for Corone. In 1993, this was the only hint of any relation to the Dark Gods, because the expansion with the Dark Shrine was not until roughly 1994. The Jagged Plain is strewn with boulders, presumably from the meteor swarm cast to smite Uthex, though rocks fall from the sky on their own, so it could be a gradual accumulation. There's a boiling sea of mud and a forest of crystals. These, interestingly, are all room objects. They were probably part of the puzzle for turning off the crystal dome. Ricarth told me he remembers being able to cast the old sorcerer spell Forget on the crystals. That spell, of course, does not exist anymore. 703 became corrupt essence. The crystal dome drains magical power. The amount it drained used to increase as you got closer to the dome. The dome will absorb up to 2,000 mana, and beyond that will explode in a lethal elemental wave. It cools off at a rate of, I think, 50 mana per experience pulse, so 100 mana per mana pulse. Supposedly turning the dome off would also turn the fog off, though I'm not sure if that's actually true, which affects the AS and DS numbers in the southern rooms. In the lower parts of the Jagged Plain, you could also get sprayed by geysers of boiling mud. Sometimes a rock will fall from the sky, as I said, another environmental hazard. The whole landscape is alien and otherworldly, barren and inhospitable. Then there is a jagged opening that leads into the McGrew tunnels. This room makes it seem like you're being watched. That will come up again later. The windows of the Dark Shrine would be directly above this spot. The tunnels are implicitly carved out by the acidic slime of the McGrew. They devour away the flesh and pile up bones in a deep bone pit. There is also a strange pile of stone spheres. These are, I think, maybe supposed to be the hazy tenebrous orbs which drop when dark vortices collapse into themselves. The dark vortices will naturally dissipate into nothingness if they wander into the Myclean cavern. So it may well be that the McGrew sweep those orbs up, unable to digest them, and end up depositing them all in the corner. Though it might also just be stone, stuff the McGrew dissolved, building up in their core, and then ejected. Either way, they pile up the spheres in one corner and the bones in the opposite corner. The Myclean cavern is gigantic. It has a huge forest of stalagmites formed by water dripping from the ceiling. There's glowing fungus all over the place, creating an eerie otherworldly vista. There's also a stream cutting across the cavern. I'll explain the significance of this stuff in the second and third episodes. There's then a huge, enormous staircase for a monstrously large gate, leading up into the darkness. The way the player maps are drawn would make you think the stairs head north, but in actuality they are carved into the north wall and head east. Whether they spiral around the cavern or only head east is unclear. It depends on just how huge the cavern is. Gemstone rooms can have wildly different scales. The stairs are longer than they are high, and the stairs go very high. So the stairs go way up into the darkness and end at a tunnel, which leads to a bas-relief of a beast with Heretic written under it. This is speaking of Morgu, who we call Marlu, and it is based on the Temple of Darkness poem. You say the magic words and end up in his dark shrine. This is a big chamber with a huge statue of him, with what are implicitly Vrul around him. There's a secret room with tall stone jars. These are what the rules slumber in, which I will talk about in the second episode. The shrine depicts sacrificing victims, which is probably illustrating a ritual for waking up or possibly making the rule. I say victims, but those are probably dark priests, so kind of more of a self-sacrifice thing. Like the huge stairwell, this chapel has a huge throne and then a huge corridor and huge windows. It is implying this place was built to accommodate Morgul himself. Because the cavern is huge and the stairwell is huge and goes east, and the corridor goes all the way back to the western end of the mountain, it follows that the player maps have the scaling on this all wrong. The corridor is much more elongated, and that vestry room doesn't actually say whether it's on the north or south wall. So if you put it on the south wall instead, the Dark Shrine is clearly shaped like an antique key. That, I believe, is symbolic in potentially a couple of ways, and we'll get into that later. Those are the original parts of the Broken Lands. The Sheruvian Monastery has some cool stuff in it, but it is pretty much unrelated to the rest of it. Near their kitchen, they have a frozen dead Sabrar. Those are the elite Valor soldiers that were wiped out at Shadowguard in the Undead War. This is an anomaly. The creator in 1997 probably interpreted the Sabrar as still existing today with contemporary membership, but the Sabrar do not exist anymore in the current lore, so this makes no sense now. The Sheruvian Monastery has a couple of locked rooms. One is the chapel, where Sheruvian priests can sometimes spawn, or Sheruvian monks as alerted guards. The other is the summoning chamber, where Sheruvian warlocks sometimes spawn. Both of those rooms spawn Greater Vrul. Because the mechanisms are not functioning totally, Greater Vrul build up until there are a few dozen in the same room. The summoning chamber has an orb that will give you severe nerve damage and strip your spells if you cast at it. This is actually the master orb for a teleportation system that no longer works. There are hidden monoliths in the Broken Lands and around the landing region that would teleport you from point to point if you transfer power to them. These would probably need to be recoded. There are 3 mana control skills now. Before the GemStone IV conversion, there was only 1. Some of the monoliths can still be looked at if you guess they are in the room, but there's no way to search for them. This would allow the Greater Vrul to move around as an environmental hazard into, say, the Lesser Vrul area, much as the Sheruvian Harbingers are an occasional hazard in the Sheruvian Monastery, where you run away. It might implicitly explain how Harbingers show up inside the sealed monastery with horses. Then at the far south end of the Sheruvian Monastery is a locked portcullis. There isn't anything on the other side of the portcullis. I got an NPC to go on the other side once. It's a deleted room. I would guess room number 4860076. I'll get back to what that means in a minute, the Real Room ID. This may have existed at some point for a storyline purpose. Since there is nothing there, and likely nothing will be there later, I have my character claim he resides on the other side of it. There are other quirks with the Sheruvian Monastery. There are torches that flare fire at you, relatively rare spawns, large black cat, cook's assistant, Sheruvian warlock in the locked rooms, banshee in the elders' chambers. The Sheruvians have geothermal baths. They have depictions of Melgrin's Reach, and one of their monoliths is actually up there on the Reach. The Sheruvian Monastery, by the way, was opened up by Drazier, the high priest of the Sheruvian Order, who had conflict with Shar and her generals back in 1998, involving an artifact called the Sphere of Midnight. So, under the hood, the rooms that exist in the game have something called Real Room IDs, sort of like the Lich room numbers, except these are the actual real room numbers in the game itself. Lich room numbers are arbitrary. It is now possible to see them on the test server by echoing the relevant part of the XML feed. That was enabled around June 2021, I think, a couple of months after I did my Graveyard series. Distinct areas of GemStone are built on a designated block of Real Room IDs. These are segments of up to 1,000 rooms. Segment 18, for example, are room numbers between 18,000 and 18,999. There might also be subsegments, like 18,100s and 18,200s. What is segment 18? It's the original rooms of the graveyard, the ones that were made back around 1990, except for the forest maze, which is part of segment 9. 180XX rooms are the top 2 levels of the graveyard. That is 18001 through 18070. 18100s are the purgatory section of the deep underground. 18200s are the frozen bottom section. This is remarkable because there's reason to think that the deep underground was actually added on slightly later than the other rooms. The much later additions to the graveyard are on segments 2138, 2156, and 2162. Not counting Shadow Valley, that's its own beast. One quirk is that segment 2156, Slither Creek, contains a few of the original rooms from 1990, which means those rooms have been separated from their original segment. Those rooms were apparently cloned, because there's a few missing room numbers on segment 18 about where those should be given the other rooms, and they might still be there but disconnected. There are a lot of places in the game that still exist but are disconnected from everything. At one point you could get into the old abandoned inn, for example, using a glyph trap, because the glyph trap still exited in the old Real Room ID instead of the new cloned copy of that room. The crypt roof was long disconnected, but is now accessible by walking. This is room 18068. The room numbers on either side of it were part of the original graveyard, so it probably was too, and did not get used for some reason. Similarly, room 18070 is the last in that sequence, the room on top of the burial mound with the depression looking like a wrathful god hit it. That may have been an original room that was not actually used until the burial mound expansion in 1998. But it might have been made later, someone writing a new room on the end of the old room segment. There's no way to really tell, at least on the player end. I'm inclined to think it is original because it is symbolically consistent, because the burial mound is supposed to look like a sunken warship. Why am I bringing this up? Well, the Slither Creek cloned rooms create some Real Room ID gaps if you're listing them all out. It's fairly obvious what those gaps are, what rooms fit the gaps on segment 18. But there's another missing room at 18059. The rooms preceding it are part of the crypt maze with the greater ghouls. It's not at all clear what's in that Real Room ID. There may be a deleted room there, or some meaningless storage room, or possibly even an unused room from 1990. The graveyard was not necessarily originally on segment 18. It's possible it was copied from somewhere else, or it's possible it was on that segment, but was overwritten later. You have similar issues with the Broken Lands and its room IDs. The original Sealfar Strake, now Lysierian Hills, is now on segment 92. The Monastery with the Liches is segment 95. The Jagged Plain with the Fog Beetles and Crystal Dome are segment 306. The McGrew through Vrul area is segment 94, and the Sheruvian Monastery is segment 487. I think I misspoke earlier. It goes up to room 487075, the portcullis room, so the other side of the portcullis might be 487076. So you have a similar situation in Slither Creek with the Sheruvian Monastery. The original hooded figure area was released with the Jagged Plain in 1993, so you would expect it to be on the same segment as the Jagged Plain. But that area is now part of the Sheruvian Monastery segment. Sheruvians occasionally wander into it. When you look at the room numbers for the Jagged Plain, the rooms at the beginning of the 306 segment are missing. This was bugging me enough that I asked Worm to check if that was the original hooded figure area. I try not to do that too often, but he seems to like my historical mysteries. It turned out I was right. Those rooms were cloned and gutted. There are also several deleted rooms. The Jagged plane itself may not be its original segment either. It might have been cloned as well, because the crystal dome used to have a puzzle for turning it off, and that's totally missing. It's not even in activated code. The puzzle is apparently just not there anymore. This was bothering me because I thought maybe some missing information might be in the missing rooms. Another quirk is that segment 93, the Sealfar Strait expansion with the crawl and the Laura Shrine, starts at 93045, a room number just large enough to fit the 1993 Broken Lands in the gap. I still do not know what is in those first rooms on segment 93, but my conjecture had been, well, the original Sealfar Strait was released in 1992, and it's on segment 92. The expansion to the Sealfar Strait was in 1993, and it's on segment 93. The Magruo and Vrul expansion was in 1994, and it's on segment 94. That'd be a weird coincidence, but it might be. The Monastery with the Liches, segment 95, was in 1992 rather than 1995, though there are a bunch of missing numbers on segment 92. So I was wondering if there were original Broken Lands rooms from 1993 in the first 44 rooms of segment 93. I still don't know. But those segments were created later, I'm told. The information is copied or overwritten. You can't, as a rule, always assume lower segment numbers are older places. Deep cosmic mysteries, weird and wild stuff. The segments are not necessarily as old as the rooms they contain. You get some simulacra and simulation weirdness going on with all of it. It's kind of metaphysical. Is a house the same house if all its material pieces have been replaced with replicas? One very subtle quirk is that in Uthex's abode, the original hooded figure area, there is an east hall and west hall, east and west from the arch. That is not part of the original area design. Those rooms were glued on later. You can see that by contrasting Z-Path's and Zoran's maps. But there's a couple of deleted rooms in the 306 segment, between the hooded figure rooms and the stalactite room number. There's also apparently a storage room at 306010, but 8 and 9 are missing. Maybe they were unused original rooms that got cloned later. And there are several deleted rooms after it too. Rooms 12 through 16 are missing. It's important to catch that about 8 and 9, though, because one of those hall rooms has fellwood chairs, and that would be weird if the room painting was before the de-ice. Fell was originally deer. There's an evil forest of deer in the source books, and the only place it was mentioned in 1992 or 1993 was in the section of the source books on evil artificial constructs that was also where the Vrul were taken from. And the forest of deer would have been somewhere near this region, northwest Jaimon. It was later established in Shadowworld canon, called the Grand Campaign, to be right next to the Sealfar Strait, because it is right next to the ruins of Kelburn on the northern end of the High Plateau. But that was years after Simulatronics and Iron Crown Enterprises had split. The Forest of Deer would have been nearby in any case. Otherwise, Deerwood would have come from Emer, which was another continent. So, it would have been nice to have known if that was an Ice Age room, even if only used later, because that would have been something exceptionally subtle but probably intentional. It would have needed to be de-iced by hand, I think. I do not think the auto-conversion to terms they did to the game would have caught Deerwood. Likewise, the other missing rooms in the segment could be related to the missing dome puzzle, especially since you can 704 phase the dome. It kills you if the dome is turned on, but if the dome is turned off, then you may have been able to go inside it. Unfortunately, we may never know unless someone remembers, because there are empty deleted room numbers. If it was possible to go inside the dome when it was turned off, it probably had some kind of information in it that was very important to the higher concept. I would guess it would be some kind of control room, because the dome is probably an ancient piece of advanced technology. That's an unavoidable problem, missing information. There could have been any number of situations involving hooded figures, for example, that are not recorded now, which might have informed how the Broken Lands should be understood. So I will do the best I can to figure out what Kygar was trying to say about the Dark Gods and Unlife in the Shadow World context, which will involve relating it to the Graveyard story, which was made before Kygar became a GM. And then in the third episode, I will look at subtext, allegory, which will further relate it to the Graveyard story. Thank you for watching this first episode of my Broken Lands exploration series. Hopefully you've learned something worth knowing, because knowing is, oh God, the horror. Hey guys, if you want to see more of my fantabulous videos, be sure to click one of these links. But I warn you, it will put you at serious risk of becoming a huge nerd. Better train in that atomic wedgie Seaman to brace yourselves. I mean, I'm assuming. Like I can be bothered to learn anything about the PSM review. Don't be a square.